Picture yourself at 17, wearing a silk gown worth a kingdom, tears soaking your pillow the night before your wedding. Your mother has just threatened to have the man you actually love killed. Tomorrow, you'll marry a duke you barely know, trading your happiness for a coronet. This isn't the beginning of a Gothic novel. It's the true story of Consuelo Vanderbilt, the reluctant duchess whose journey from gilded prisoner to independent woman would rewrite the rules of society. When they called her the most beautiful debutante in America, they didn't realize they were describing a masterpiece trapped in its own frame. This is the story of how wealth beyond imagination became chains of gold, and how one woman's rebellion against the glittering cage of the Gilded Age would inspire generations. On the 2nd of March 1877, as America's Gilded Age reached its glittering zenith, Consuelo Vanderbilt entered life bearing the weight of expectations that would nearly crush her spirit. Born into America's wealthiest family, she emerged from childhood carrying both extraordinary beauty and invisible chains, a combination that would shape her destiny in ways both magnificent and tragic. Alva Vanderbilt, her mother, wielded ambition like a weapon, carving out the family's place in society with the same ruthless determination that her husband William Kissam Vanderbilt used to expand their railroad empire. Young Consuelo, blessed with a swan-like neck, luminous eyes, and an ethereal grace that turned heads wherever she went, became her mother's masterpiece in making. Every breath, every gesture, every word was sculpted according to Alva's exacting standards. The limestone mansion at 65th Avenue, where Consuelo spent her formative years, served as both palace and prison. Within its opulent walls, she endured a rigorous education that went far beyond the typical finishing school curriculum. Alva's iron will shaped every aspect of her daughter's upbringing, from deportment to discourse, moulding her into the perfect vessel for the family's social aspirations. The physical and emotional demands of this grooming paled in comparison to the psychological conditioning that accompanied it. Constant reminders that the Vanderbilt name carried obligations that superseded personal happiness. As Consuelo grew, her mother's plans crystallized with frightening precision. Alva had not invested years of careful cultivation merely to see her daughter marry into American society. No, she had grander ambitions. A European title that would elevate the Vanderbilts above their nouveau riche peers. The fact that American heiresses had begun trading fortunes for coronets, in what the press dubbed the dollar princess phenomenon, only strengthened Alva's resolve. When Consuelo made her society debut in 1895, she set New York ablaze with speculation. Her grace and beauty made the other debutantes seem coarse by comparison. Her regal bearing seemed to presage her future role. But behind the carefully orchestrated appearances, behind the silk gowns and practiced smiles, a quiet rebellion was brewing. Consuelo had formed an attachment to a New York socialite, Winthrop Rutherford, whose lack of title made him unacceptable in Alva's calculating eyes. The summer season brought a whirlwind of social engagements, each one carefully orchestrated by Alva, to position her daughter for the grand finale she had planned. As summer faded into autumn, whispers began circulating through Newport and New York about negotiations with a cash-strapped English duke. Consuelo, drowning in her mother's ambitions, found herself swept toward a fate she never chose, her own desires as irrelevant as last season's fashions. That autumn, as Manhattan's elite gathered in their Fifth Avenue mansions to trade gossip over tea, Alva Vanderbilt prepared to play her final hand in the game of social advancement. And the stakes were her daughter's heart and happiness, though such considerations seemed trivial compared to the glittering prize of a ducal coronet. Through the gilded halls of New York society, speculation mounted as November approached, each whispered conversation carrying the weight of impending transformation. In November 1895, as autumn's last leaves clung desperately to Manhattan's trees, Consuelo Vanderbilt faced the most devastating battle of her young life. Behind the magnificent doors of her family's Fifth Avenue mansion, Alva Vanderbilt, orchestrated what would become known as one of the most ruthless matrimonial campaigns in American social history. The Duke of Marlborough had arrived in New York that fall, his ancient title burnished, but his coffers empty. Charles Spencer Churchill, known since childhood as Sonny, came seeking what so many of his peers sought in America: a fortune to restore his crumbling ancestral seat, Blenheim Palace. In Consuelo, he found not only extraordinary beauty and impeccable breeding, but also the vast Vanderbilt wealth that could save his estate. The young heiress's resistance to the match sparked a domestic siege that would haunt her for decades. Alva, determined to secure a duchess's coronet for her daughter, employed tactics that shocked even their jaded social circle. When Consuelo's heart turned toward Winthrop Rutherford, Alva's rage knew no bounds. She even threatened to have the young man killed. Through emotional manipulation and relentless pressure, she wore down her daughter's resistance until the inevitable surrender. On the morning of the 6th of November, 1895, New York witnessed what the press dubbed the wedding of the century. St. Thomas Church overflowed with society's elite, the cream of American and European aristocracy gathering to witness the union. Yet few among the assembled guests could see the tears that had soaked Consuelo's pillow the night before, or sense the deep despair beneath her composed exterior. As she walked down the aisle in her Worth gown, her face partially concealed by a delicate veil, Consuelo carried the weight of her mother's ruthless ambition. The ceremony itself was a masterpiece of social theatre, with Bishop Henry Codman Potter officiating as the Duke awaited his American bride. The wedding breakfast that followed at the Vanderbilt mansion featured a guest list that read like a complete edition of the social register. Yet amid the champagne toasts and celebratory fanfare, the newly minted Duchess of Marlborough remained oddly silent, her thoughts perhaps dwelling on what might have been. The price of this social triumph was calculated in cold numbers: a dowry of $2.5 million in railroad stock, a staggering sum equivalent to over $75 million in today's currency. The human cost, the sacrifice of a young woman's happiness and free will, went unrecorded in the society columns that breathlessly detailed every aspect of the celebration. In the weeks that followed, as Consuelo prepared for her new life in England, Manhattan's drawing rooms buzzed with speculation about the match. Some praised Alva's brilliant manoeuvring, while others whispered about the ruthlessness of her methods. But none could deny that she had achieved her ultimate goal. Her daughter would cross the Atlantic, not as another wealthy American bride, but as her grace, the Duchess of Marlborough. As the newlyweds departed for England, leaving behind the glimmer of New York society, autumn storms battered the Atlantic. The turbulent crossing seemed an apt metaphor for the upheaval that awaited the reluctant Duchess in her new homeland, where ancient traditions and aristocratic expectations would test the limits of her endurance. Blenheim Palace rose before Consuelo in the late autumn of 1895, its massive facade a monument to centuries of aristocratic power. The seat of the Dukes of Marlborough stood as both a triumph of English Baroque architecture and a crushing symbol of the responsibilities that now lay upon her young shoulders. The American-born Duchess found herself mistress of one of England's grandest estates, its vast rooms and endless corridors, the weight of tradition she was expected to uphold. The crisis facing Blenheim was immediate and severe. Years of neglect had left the palace in a state of elegant decay that even its magnificent architecture could no longer disguise. Water damage threatened priceless tapestries, while entire wings stood empty, their furnishings sold off by previous generations. The marriage settlement, which provided an annual income of $100,000 to the Duke and an additional $100,000 to Consuelo, would soon be put to use, funding extensive renovations that would save this architectural treasure from ruin. Yet even as she threw herself into the restoration of Blenheim, Consuelo discovered that renovating a palace was far easier than building a marriage. The Duke, while unfailingly polite, maintained an emotional distance that grew more pronounced with each passing month. Their union, founded on mutual duty rather than affection, settled into a pattern of elaborate courtesy that masked profound loneliness on both sides. Motherhood arrived with mechanical precision as demanded by duty. The birth of their first son, John Albert Edward William Spencer Churchill, in 8 fulfilled the primary obligation of a duchess, providing an heir to the dukedom. A second son, Lord Ivor Spencer Churchill, followed in 1898, completing the expected heir and spare. The children brought moments of joy to Consuelo's life, but they could not fill the emotional void at the heart of her marriage. The young duchess found her true calling in the role of social reformer. She threw herself into philanthropic works with an energy that surprised and sometimes scandalized traditional aristocratic circles. Under her direction, Blenheim became a centre for progressive social initiatives. She established programs for the estate's workers and their families, including housing improvements and educational opportunities. Her work with London's poor, particularly unwed mothers and their children, revealed a compassion that transcended class boundaries. In English society, Consuelo's beauty and natural grace made her a sensation. The American Duchess brought a fresh vitality to the often staid world of the British aristocracy, her presence at social functions drawing attention and admiration. Yet beneath the surface, success lay a growing awareness that she had traded one gilded cage for another. The Duke, meanwhile, pursued his own interests and companionship elsewhere. Their public appearances together became increasingly formal affairs, choreographed to maintain the appearance of marital harmony while masking the reality of their estrangement. The palace that had once seemed like a fairy tale setting began to feel more like an elaborate stage set for a performance neither of them believed in anymore. As the new century dawned, bringing with it winds of social change, Consuelo began to question the bargain that had brought her to Blenheim. The price of her title, her freedom, her happiness, her very sense of self seemed increasingly steep. The restoration of Blenheim was progressing, but the woman who had helped save it was quietly crumbling behind her perfect Duchess facade. In 1906, the facade finally began to crack, and the comfortable fiction of the Marlboroughs' marriage could no longer withstand the pressure of their mutual unhappiness. The Duchess, who had once been America's most celebrated bride, was about to scandalize society once again, this time by choosing her own path. The Marlboroughs' separation in 1906 marked the end of what society had once heralded as the perfect union of old-world nobility and new-world wealth. For Consuelo, now 29, the decision to separate marked the beginning of a profound personal transformation, though the legal bonds would take many more years to fully dissolve. In the aftermath of the separation, Consuelo emerged from the shadows of her imposed role to discover her own voice. No longer bound by the strict protocols of her position as Duchess of Marlborough, she threw herself into causes that reflected her true passions. Her work with the Women's Municipal Party in London revealed a keen political mind that had long been masked by her social duties. The suffragette movement found in her an eloquent advocate, her own experience of powerlessness lending authenticity to her support for women's rights. The years following the separation saw Consuelo flourish in unexpected ways. She established herself as a formidable public speaker, addressing crowds on social reform and women's suffrage. Her philanthropic work expanded, focusing particularly on improving conditions for women and children in London's most deprived areas. The woman who had once been valued primarily for her beauty and wealth proved herself a capable organiser and passionate advocate for social change. When World War I erupted in 1914, Consuelo channeled her organisational skills into vital war relief efforts. As chair of the Economic Relief Committee for the American Women's War Relief Fund, she worked tirelessly to aid those affected by the conflict. Her efforts during these years earned recognition from both the British government and international relief organisations, establishing her as a leader in humanitarian causes. Throughout these years, she maintained a dignified silence about her marriage, even as society buzzed with speculation. The Duke had his own life now, and Consuelo found herself increasingly drawn to a different future. In Jacques Balsan, a French pioneer of balloon and airplane aviation, she discovered the possibility of a love based on mutual respect and shared interests rather than social obligation. The long path to divorce finally concluded in 1921. The legal dissolution of her marriage to the Duke of Marlborough marked not just the end of a union, but the beginning of Consuelo's true independence. The Duke would later petition for an annulment from the Anglican Church, with Consuelo's consent, a process that would reach its conclusion in 1926. The annulment would validate what she had known all along, that her consent to the marriage had never been freely given. The years between separation and divorce had transformed the once dutiful Duchess into a woman of substance and independence. Her beauty, which had once been her primary currency in society's marriage market, was now merely one aspect of a complex and accomplished personality. The skills she had developed as a young Duchess were now directed toward meaningful, charitable initiatives, while her experience of arranged marriage made her a powerful voice for women's autonomy. As the post-war world emerged from the ashes of conflict, Consuelo stood ready to embrace a new chapter in her life. The woman who had once walked down the aisle of St. Thomas Church in tears now faced her future with clear-eyed determination. The price of her freedom had been high, but its value was beyond measure. In 1921, at the age of 44, Consuelo Vanderbilt began her second act. Her marriage to Jacques Balsan marked not just a new union, but the triumph of personal choice over social obligation. Unlike the theatrical spectacle of her first wedding, this ceremony celebrated a genuine connection between two people who had chosen each other freely. The contrast could not have been more profound. Where the young Duchess had once walked down the aisle in tears, Consuelo Balsan now moved forward with quiet joy. The years with Jacques proved transformative. Their shared life between France and America allowed Consuelo to bridge the two worlds that had shaped her existence. At their French estate, Château Saint-Georges Motel, she created the kind of home that Blenheim, for all its grandeur, had never been. The gardens she designed there reflected her mature taste, free from the constraints of aristocratic tradition. Her relationship with her sons, John and Ivor, evolved and deepened through the years, demonstrating that maternal bonds could survive and even thrive beyond the confines of a failed marriage. The 1930s brought new challenges as Europe darkened under the shadow of fascism. When France fell to Nazi Germany in 1940, the Balsans were forced to flee, leaving behind their beloved chateau. They made their way to America, where Consuelo once again demonstrated her resilience. During these years, she channeled her energy into supporting the Free French movement and various relief organizations aiding European refugees. In 1953, Consuelo published her memoir, The Glitter and the Gold. The book offered more than just a glimpse into the vanished world of the Gilded Age. It served as a thoughtful meditation on privilege, duty, and the high price of social ambition. With remarkable candor, she detailed her mother's ruthless machinations and her own journey from powerless young bride to independent woman. The memoir became a bestseller, introducing a new generation to her story. Throughout these later years, Consuelo maintained a dignified relationship with her first husband. When the Duke of Marlborough died in 1934, she penned a touching tribute to him, acknowledging their shared history while celebrating how far they both had come from their ill-fated beginning. Her own mother, Alva, had testified during the annulment proceedings, acknowledging her role in forcing her daughter into the marriage, a final confirmation of what Consuelo had always known. The woman who emerged in these decades bore little resemblance to the frightened teenage bride of 1895. Her beauty, once her primary asset in society's eyes, had matured into an elegant grace that reflected her inner development. The skills she had learned managing Blenheim found expression in her charitable work and the management of her own estates. The diplomatic abilities she had developed navigating aristocratic society served her well in her humanitarian efforts. The loss of her son Ivor in 1956 marked a profound personal tragedy in her later years. Yet Consuelo maintained her strength and dignity, continuing her charitable work and maintaining close ties with her remaining family. She had learned long ago that life's greatest challenges often led to unexpected forms of growth. Consuelo Vanderbilt Balsan died on the 6th of December 1964 in Southampton, Long Island. She was 87 years old and had lived to see the world of her youth, with its rigid social hierarchies and arranged marriages, fade into history. Her legacy lived on not in titles or coronets, but in the example she set of a woman who had found the courage to chart her own course. In the end, her story transcended the familiar narrative of an American heiress trading wealth for a title. Instead, it became something far more compelling. The journey of a woman who had transformed a gilded cage into a launching pad for a life of substance and meaning. The reluctant Duchess had become, at last, simply herself. And now, I'd like to see you in the comments. Is the story of Consuelo Vanderbilt a tragedy? Or is it something kind of inspiring, finding meaning against the pressures of high society? I can't wait to hear from you, and thanks for joining me for another episode. Ta-ta. Until next time.